Start the main program with a recitation of Quran.
I can do 24, 24, 24. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا آباءكم وإخوانكم أولياء إن استحبوا الكفر على الإيمان ومن يتولهم منكم فأولئك هم الظالمون. قل إن كان آباؤكم وأبناؤكم وإخوانكم وأزواجكم وعشيرتكم وأموال اقترفتموها وتجارة تخشون كسادها ومساكن ترضونها أحب إليكم من الله ورسوله وجهاد في سبيله فتربصوا حتى يأتي الله بأمره والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. لقد نصركم الله في مواطن كثيرة ويوم حنين إذ أعجبتكم كثرتكم فلم تغن عنكم شيئا وضاقت عليكم الأرض بما رحبت ثم وليتم مدبرين ثم أنزل الله سكينته على رسوله وعلى المؤمنين وأنزل جنودا لم تروها وتعذب الذين كفروا وذلك جزاء الكافرين. ثم يتوب الله من بعد ذلك على من يشاء والله غفور رحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إنما المشركون نجس فلا يقربوا المسجد الحرام بعد عامهم هذا وإن خفتم عيلة فسوف يغنيكم الله من فضله إن شاء إن الله عليم حكيم. صدق الله العظيم.
Today we are very fortunate to have Shaykh Ali Reza Khaki, who will be speaking to us on the topic of why are unbelievers impure, or are they? Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Shaykh Ali Reza Khaki has been studying Islamic Studies and is involved in inter and intra-faith work and community cohesion. He graduated from Mahdi Institute and completed his postgrad studies in Islamic Studies and currently teaches the Islamic Studies module at the Institute. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. صلوات. It's good to be back here after a long time. So just before we start, I don't know if you can see the slides. The slides coming. Yeah. So of course we were limited in what we could put as the title for the advertisement. So this is the actual title: Why are non-believers considered ritually impure? Najis. Of course, the term najis is translated as being ritually impure. Or are they? And this is looking at it from a Shii jurisprudential perspective. And the purpose of this is to see the diversity within Shii scholars, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but also to have an appreciation of how these jurists come up with these conclusions. These jurists have access to the same texts, but they come up with different conclusions. So we'll look at this, and by no means, I'll put out a disclaimer there, by no means is this a comprehensive study, and also this isn't your normal majlis. So for the online crowd, I have to put the disclaimer out. This isn't a majlis, so look away if you're looking for a majlis. But within this, we'll get an appreciation of what tools the jurist has at play to come up with rulings. And of course, the whole notion of impurity, ritual impurity rather. So let's say we are here sitting and my hand gets some dirt on it. That's dirt. That's not ritual impurity. It may be an impurity, but I can still pray with it. Ritual impurity will have implications on rituals, like I can't pray with it, I need to clean it. So just putting it out there. So we are also going to have a bit of interaction. So, if you can join in on slider.com, the hashtag is nudges. I couldn't, I had to, it was either that or tahara. It was shorter. Okay, so I'd like your input. How do you think a jurist, a faqih, mujtahid derives law? So if you want to speak out, please speak out. If you want to join in online, please feel free. Quran, Hadith, Aql. So you're getting a gist of a few things that the jurist utilizes in deriving law. But there's so much more of a nuance. There may be jurists who have the same morality. That's an interesting one. Scholarly debates, opinions of other scholars, precedent. Indeed, so all of these play into the jurist's deduction of the law. And really what happens is sometimes jurists have their premises that they build on and use that to derive the law. Now, particularly on the topic that we're at hand, the ritual impurity of non-Muslims, there's a variety of opinions out there. There's a mainstream opinion that we'll look at. But just to summarize, so there are generally speaking, four trends with regard to ritual impurity of non-Muslims. The first trend, all non-Muslims, and of course there's a definition of the kafir. We're going to use it very broadly here. We'll consider anyone who's not a Muslim as a kafir. All non-Muslims are ritually impure, right? So this was the view which was held before Ayatollah Mohsin al-Hakim. They would consider all non-Muslims as ritually impure, as najis. Then comes Ayatollah Mohsin al-Hakim, and he sort of challenges the status quo and says that, hold on, all these ahadith that we have, they're talking about the purity of the Ahlul Kitab. So, not all non-Muslims are impure, but only those who are not Ahlul Kitab. Ahlul Kitab are considered pure. So after Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim, there's this discussion. But even then, contemporary scholars, mainstream scholars will still say that the Ahlul Kitab are impure ihtiyatan, out of precaution, which means after their deductions, after their analysis of the texts, they conclude that they may not be impure, ritually impure, but out of precaution they'll say they're ritually impure. So they're basing it on precaution. And this is a good chunk of scholars. Ayatollah Khouy falls into this, Sistani, say Ayatollah Sistani, and many others. And then we have the third one is all are ritually pure except the obstinate kafir. The kafir who is obstinate, who is vehemently opposed against Islam, and this is the view of Ayatollah Sani'i. The last view is everyone is ritually pure, everyone is tahir. The atheist, the kafir, the Buddhist, the Ahlul Kitab, everyone is pure. Sayyid Fadlallah, Ayatollah Muhammad Ibrahim Jannati, Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, amongst a few others. So the question is, why, and I gave an allusion to this, why do you think different mujtahids, based on the same texts, reach different conclusions? Social norms. Everyone has a different thought process, different methodologies, time in history, environment, cultural influences, appeasing audience. And what we'll do in this presentation is we'll look at the evidences utilized by both camps. Those that believe that the non-Muslim is ritually impure, and those that believe that they are ritually pure. And we'll also look at, I'll mention Sayyid Khoui's comments on this discussion, because he's done a lengthy discussion on the topic and he's been very critical at some points. Time in history. So there are many different reasons why mujtahids reach different conclusions. Sometimes they have their premises that that they work with. They have their worldview that they build on. So for example, we have instances where, for example, Sayyid Khouy does a detailed discussion on the time of Maghrib, and he concludes that the time of Maghrib is when the sun sets, not when the redness disappears. However, he then says, because it is what the Shias have been doing, hence we will continue with that. And even in this discussion, as we'll see later on, he reaches a similar sort of conclusion, that the non-Muslim is ritually pure. However, as a precaution, because the early scholars and the later Shia scholars considered them impure, we'll go and do ihtiyat. We'll look at this. Now the question, just to gauge and to introspect also, is, do you think the non-Muslim is najis? And by no means is the audience at Mehfil Ali a gauge for what the Shias think. Oh no, because the last time I did a poll, I was saying, this is what the Shias think or something like that. This is, yeah. Okay. So this is for your own introspection. Now let's go into the evidences. What evidences do these mujtahids have with regard to the non-Muslim being impure? So let's look at these evidences. First of all, we start off with the Quran. So the verse that was recited, 928, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إنما المشركون نجس فلا يقربوا المسجد الحرام بعد عامهم هذا. This is Ali Kuli Karai's translation. O you who have faith, the polytheists are indeed unclean. So let them not approach the holy mosque after this year. So they have taken najas as meaning najis. Very important to make a note, mental note of the term najas, because this term comes later on in the discussion. And then some have also said in Surah 9:30-31 that وقالت اليهود عزير ابن الله وقالت النصارى المسيح ابن الله, and at the end of the verse سبحانه عما يشركون. So the Jews are saying that Uzair is son of God, the Christians are saying Jesus son of God, glory be to God, he is free from what they are associating with him. So some have extended and said the Jews and Christians fall into the remit of mushrikun. However, we won't go into these detailed discussions, but just a brief overview. This is the verse that is used, although many a scholar, jurist, has debated and said that najas is not najis. Yeah, then we'll come to that also. And there's a plenitude of narrations out there that talk also about the plenitude of narrations that are used by jurists to deduce that the non-Muslim is najis. An interesting thing to note, however, is that all of these narrations are talking about the Ahlul Kitab. They aren't talking about mushrikun. And in these narrations, when the Imams are approached, nowhere do the Imams invoke this verse, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ. So let's look at some of these verses, these hadith that I mentioned. So Sahiha Muhammad bin Muslim. I asked Imam Baqir about the utensils of the Ahlul Dhimma, those non-Muslims living amongst Muslims, wal-Majus. فقال لا تأكلوا في آنيتهم ولا من طعامهم الذين يطبخون. Do not eat in the utensils and neither from their food which they cook. ولا في آنيتهم التي يشربون فيها الخمر. And neither drink from the utensils in which they drink alcohol. So, well, from the apparent, some have taken that we can't eat, they're considered impure. Sayyid Khouy in his discussion, debates and said, this doesn't show the intrinsic impurity of the Ahlul Kitab. Rather, what it's showing, and that the last part actually indicates to this, is because of what they're eating or what they're drinking, do not eat from their utensils, or do not eat from the food that they're having because of what they're having. And this is Sayyid Khoui's critique of this hadith. So it's because of the alcohol that the Imam is telling them not to drink from their utensils. There's another, and I'm just taking a few narrations. There are many narrations. We'll just look at a few. I asked Imam Sadiq, somebody asks, a companion, عن قوم مسلمين يأكلون, Muslims who are eating, and a Majusi enters upon them, and should they call him to eat? Imam replies, as for me, I don't eat with the Majus, and however I despise to prohibit for you what you do in your lands. So some have taken this as saying Imam doesn't eat from the Majus, so we shouldn't by priority. Sayyid Khouy again critiques this and says this doesn't show the intrinsic impurity of the Ahlul Kitab here. He's just saying that this is what the Imam does. Imam is also explicit later on. He says, I don't want to stop you from doing this. If you do it, I don't want to prevent you from doing it. That's eating and drinking from their utensils. What about shaking hands or coming in contact? Again, there's a plenitude of narrations. We look at a few. Imam Baqir is asked about a man who shook hands with a Majusi. He said he should wash his hands. Another narrations just below that. I met, this person says, I met a dhimmi, a non-Muslims, and we shook hands. Imam says, wipe your hand bit-turab wa bil-hayat. Wipe your hand with the dust and with the wall. قُلْتُ فَالنَّاصِبْ قَالَ اغْسِلْهَا. As for the one who has enmity towards us, the Imam is saying, wash your hands. Again, Ayatollah Khouy is saying that look, none of these are talking about the intrinsic impurity. It could be that these individuals may have some impurity, secondary impurity, and hence there's an encouragement to wash hands. So anyway, this is briefly looking at the narrations used by the camp that invokes or is of the view that the non-Muslim is impure. There are other evidences, and these other evidences are challenged too. There's a claimed ijma. Sharif al-Murtada says that وَمِمَّنْ فَرَدَتْ بِهِ الْإِمَامِيَّةِ الْقَوْلِ بِنَجَاسَةِ سُؤْرِ الْيَهُودِ وَالنَّصَارَى. What's unique about the Imamiyah, the Ithna Ashari, is that they consider the tools of the Yahud and the Nasrani, the Jew and the Christian, to be impure. Interesting to note, within Sunni fiqh, this isn't as prevalent as is within Shii fiqh, of considering the non-Muslim as ritually impure. Again, these are contested claims. What about the evidences used for the purity of the non-Muslim? Now, at the very basic, for those scholars that consider everyone to be pure, the very basis that they base it on is what's known as the principle of purity. The principle of purity is everything is pure until you know otherwise, until you have evidence to show that it's impure. And this is used in fiqh quite a bit. An example of this utilization of principle purity we can see in Ayatollah Sistani's Code of Practice for Muslims in the West, where he outlines that everything is ritually pure unless you know that it is ritually impure. And this is particular with regard to the Ahlul Kitab. And he continues, I have not put that in the slide, but he says the Ahlul Kitab, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, are ritually pure as long as you do not know that they have become ritually impure by coming into contact with an impure object. You can follow this ruling when dealing with them. You can assume that ritual purity of any person that you meet and shake hands with that person, even if it's wet, as long as you do not know his faith. And you're not obliged to even ask his faith, even if it's easy for you to ask. I'm paraphrasing. So this is an example of the principle of purity, asalatut tahara, that is being applied by a contemporary mainstream scholar, and it's quite mainstream, the principle of purity, and utilized in different chapters of fiqh too. Principle of purity is the basis. What about Quranic evidences? As I mentioned, the verse, and we'll come to that verse, but prior to that, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, 1770, that we have honored the children of Adam. This is a verse that is used by proponents of the view that everyone is pure. Argument is, if Allah has honored Bani Adam, who are we to say that they are impure? Right? They're all, this karama is extending to all of Bani Adam. And then there is the verse 928, as we've read, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ. This najas, Ayatollah Khoi himself, many contemporary scholars do not use this verse in proving the impurity, ritual impurity of the non-Muslim. In fact, Allama Tabatabai and many others, Shahid Baqir al-Sadr, mention that najas is talking about a mindset, is talking about ideological impurity. Innamal mushrikuna najasun isn't physical impurity, it's talking about. In addition to that, Sayyid Khoi mentions that it isn't utilized, this term najas, and others have mentioned that it isn't utilized at the time of the Prophet. If you look at the seerah of the Prophet, they do not utilize it as though it is physical impurity. They're taking it to be something else. Some have even gone further. Ayatollah Muntaziri mentioned that this distinction of kafir and Muslim is a political one. فلا يقرب المسجد الحرام بعد عامهم هذا وإن خفتم عيلة فسوف يغنيكم الله من فضله. If you fear, let them not approach the Masjid al-Haram after this year. If you fear loss of wealth, etc., Allah will make you rich. So it seems that there's something else at play. There may be, some have argued that it's a sort of exclusivity that is given to the Muslims, that they have this place, Masjidul Haram, everyone else is outside that fold, and it prevents this place from being a sort of tourist place. And Allah mentions that if you fear loss of wealth, that Allah will enrichen you. So this is another argument that is also utilized. Going on to the narrations, Sayyid Fadlullah mentions that the number of narrations outlining the purity of the non-Muslim have reached to such a high level, to the level of istifada, to the level where it's so widely spread. In addition to them being many sahih hadith. Example, I'm just taking a few again. سألت أبا عبد الله عن مؤاكلة اليهود والنصراني والمجوس فقال إذا كان من طعامك وتوضأ فلا بأس. I asked Imam Sadiq about eating with Jews and Christians and Majus, to which he replied, if it is from your food and is washed or they wash, then there is no problem. It seems that these ahadith are indicating to hygiene, and they are emphasizing time and time again, do not eat from their pots and pans or utensils if they use wine, and in other narrations if they have pork, or if they wash. It seems that washing is something very important. It seems like it's alluding to some sort of hygiene. And other narrations, a person, in this second narration, a person converts, he says, I was a Christian, I've converted, my family is still Christian, should I eat with them? The Imam asks him, do they eat pork? To which he said no, however they drink alcohol. Imam said, don't worry, eat and drink with them. So it seems that, and Ayatollah Khoi concludes also, that none of these narrations indicate to the intrinsic impurity of the non-Muslim. However, despite all these narrations and Ayatollah's critique of the narrations that are indicative, perhaps by some, of the ritual impurity of non-Muslims, Ayatollah Khoi says that we will still consider them ritually impure as a precaution, because the previous scholars and many contemporary scholars have considered them ritually impure. So he has made this discussion. So this is just giving you a flavor of how different mujtahids reach different conclusions, the arguments they use, and the conclusions they reach despite having access to the same texts. So with that, I will stop on this topic, and because it is the wiladat of Imam Hassan al-Askari, we'll share a narration of Imam Hassan al-Askari where it says, ليس العبادة كثرة الصيام والصلاة, that ibadah isn't excessive prayer and fasting. وإنما العبادة كثرة التفكر في أمر الله, that worship is excessive thinking in the affairs of Allah. I'll end with that and open up the floor to any questions.
Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Any questions from either side?
Thank you, Ali Reza. So when you say Majus, what do you mean by Majus?
What the Quran says. There's a discussion among scholars. Some have said that it is Zoroastrians. And in fact, some have considered Zoroastrians as from Ahlul Kitab. I think Ayatollah Khamenei does consider them from Ahlul Kitab. There's a point of discussion here, but I would think that perhaps it's some religion that is either like Zoroastrianism or is Zoroastrianism.
But not Christianity or Judaism.
No.
Yeah? Okay. So the main thing is that in the Quran you find that, if I'm not mistaken, that salvation is possible for the Ahlul Kitab. And other fuqaha say you can marry Ahlul Kitab. So if you cannot eat from them, and this creates, but salvation is the bigger thing, which means that impurity is really secondary.
Yeah.
And last point is that Saif Fadlallah, I remember he told us that my problem was not with the Christians and the Jews. My problem was with the Lebanese who had become agnostic. And my people were coming and saying, are they now tahir or not? So that's why his discussion is much wide-ranging than otherwise. So that's why he encompasses everything. And he says only the visit to the Masjid al-Haram is for Muslims. Everything else is okay. And as you know, the Sunnis also, many of them consider the zabiha of the Jews and the Christians as valid. Christians don't do it now, but the Jews still do it. So many Sunnis still eat kosher.
Kosher meat. Yeah. Very interesting how circumstances may influence the way the mujtahid sees and deduces law.
And just one question from Slider Online. Why is this such a conflicting topic? What are the practical implications of saying someone is najis or not najis?
Practical implications, there may be ethical considerations there in how we view others. How, it does boil down to how I see someone else. If I'm interacting with a non-Muslim, and I can speak from my own experience, if I consider them impure, I've already put them somewhere below. So it does have practical implications. And the reason why we're discussing this topic is just for us to get insight into the diversity, to the way the scholar works, and how they derive law.
So my question is, for all these centuries, the Shia community always considered everybody except Muslims as being tahir. Why wasn't there a situation where they thought otherwise?
So for all the centuries, the Shias considered non-Muslims as tahir.
As najis, not tahir.
As najis. So why is it changed?
Yeah, I mean, because we're talking about 13th or 12th centuries, whatever, right? For all that period, wasn't there not the same discussion happening?
There may have been some discussion, and some of these terms are later developments also. This whole notion of najasa and tahara we find later on within history developing. The Imams never said najis or not najis. The Imam said, for example, if there's blood or something, wash it off. So now what the community has taken that as, later on in the development of fiqh, there's now notions of najasa being built around these ahadith. So first of all, the Shia community isn't a Shia community as we know today. They've all these nuances, variances, etc. So there may have not been a monolith of Shia. Secondly, the development of fiqh happens over a whole historical period. So maybe many were not privy to these discussions, or maybe they were, maybe these discussions were being held. But once this is now fossilized into a whole system of fiqh, and now this notion comes in, there may have been discussions, but it doesn't seem so evident.
So, so my then question is going back. So during the time of, Shaykh Sharif al-Murtada, for example, or before that, do we know what was the situation then?
Yeah, it doesn't seem that there was this discussion or debate around this topic. It seems like it was taken for granted that it is as it is. But then later on, certain scholars, there are exceptions to the rule always. There are Ibn Junayd, for example, early Shii scholar. He goes against many rulings. He goes against ijma at times of the scholars. So there are exceptions to the rules at different points, but as a whole, it's taken for granted.
Sorry, what do you mean by taken for granted? Are they considered as tahir? Is that what you're saying?
No, the opposite. So it's taken, as I said, the mainstream view that they were prior to Mohsin al-Hakim, that they are impure, the non-Muslims.
So my question is, how far back does that go? You said that time of the Imams, were they considered separate?
I don't know exactly how far back it would go, but I would assume Allama Hilli, post Allama Hilli, there is now fiqh being fossilized in how we know it today. Prior to that, there may have not been the science of fiqh as we know it today. There may have been views here and there, but yeah, I think post Allama Hilli is when it actually becomes fossilized. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sheikh. Could you just expand a little bit on how we know the other things that are najis? So how do we come to the conclusion that other things are najis, just so that we can make the comparison with the
So
kafir?
Quran mentions إنما الخمر والميسر والأنصاب والأزلام رجس من عمل الشيطان. Term najis isn't used, but rijs is interpreted as that which is impure, ritually impure. There are narrations, for example, as I mentioned, if somebody has blood or something like that, there are narrations that the Imam says wash. So there's in the understanding of the individuals that we need to wash. Or as I mentioned later on, now this is becoming fossilized into fiqh. That now this is what we call today in fiqh as najis. So over time, so yes, in the Quran and Hadith we have those indications. Alaykum salam.
Verse number 5, Surah Ma'idah, it says, اليوم أحل لكم الطيبات وطعام الذين أوتوا الكتاب حل لكم وطعامكم حل لهم. It means that their food is halal for you and your food. Of course, this means every food except meat, of course. Yeah? Is that clear that? So they are not najis and we can eat their food.
This is look. I included that verse in the opinion of those who consider them as tahir, Ahlul Kitab, right? I removed that for brevity, to have a shorter discussion.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, that's why the ruling for Ahlul Kitab, mainstream ruling, would be that their food is considered pure.
Yeah.
However, they would then come back and say that verse may be qualified by other conditions, etc. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the position of Sayyid Mohsin al-Hakim? Because
So
I remember that in I think we were in Uganda still, and there was a huge commotion. People are saying, hundreds of years we have thought this is najis. Now suddenly this man comes and says it's okay. So what's changed here?
So I guess Sayyid al-Hakim, all these narrations that are there, they're all talking about the purity of the Ahlul Kitab. Right? There's a host of narrations, Sahih narrations, Muwathaq, etc. So say up until this point, as we mentioned now, the Shias just took it as it is, that everybody is saying it's najis, the Ahlul Kitab are najis. Sayyid al-Hakim actually looks at these narrations and says, hold on, it doesn't make sense. All these narrations are there. Why are they najis? So he goes against what Sharif al-Murtada is saying, that the Shias all consider the utensils of the Jews and the Christians as impure. Now he's going against what seems to be a consensus amongst the Shias. Why? Based on his understanding of the narrations. And then he deduces this ruling, which changes after him, which causes a shift after him from what was before.
Can you, thank you very much for your talk. Can you talk a little bit about how, building on from what Iqbal Uncle just said, how common is it that there is a consensus of scholars believing one thing, and that basically turning into a consensus of the scholars believing the opposite thing within a generation. Like that's a material difference in a change of ruling. That seems to indicate then that consensus at any period of time is obviously is not an indication of anything, because it can change within a generation by a good argument. So is this a common phenomenon, and what should we learn from that about those who stand up against consensus?
So there are always instances where there are claimed consensuses. It's really difficult to say that there is a consensus that all the Shia ulama believe in certain things. There are certain things that all Muslims believe in, but other than that, there are instances in history, as for example I mentioned Ibn Junayd. He's challenging many instances of ijmas or claimed ijmas. And sometimes what happens is once somebody stands up and challenges, it really opens up everybody's minds. An example is Sayyid Mohsin al-Hakim. How common it is, I'm not too sure. I'd have to research into that. But there are instances where there are claimed ijmas. The whole notion of ijma is debatable, and it's a point of contention within Shii jurisprudence. And what is ijma? How can the Shia scholars reach a consensus? Ultimately, within the Shia fiqh and usul fiqh, it's the hand of the imam that is coming in and dictating or informing this consensus. But yeah, whether there can be a consensus is a point of debate, and there have been instances where mainstream views have changed over time because people have questioned and challenged them. Scholars, mujtahids, have questioned and challenged them, and what it tells us that this whole interpretation of law based on the Quran and Sunnah is a human endeavor, and it may change. Trends change over time. For the mujtahid, they absolve themselves. They would say they've done their best and they've come up to a conclusion. Another mujtahid will come and say that, hold on, I disagree with you. I come up with a different conclusion. So in the mind of the mujtahid, they're doing their best in searching for what God is trying to say. But ultimately, it's a human endeavor, and may be prone to error, and may be prone to changing over time.
Just one more question on the views of Sayyid Fadlullah on the right hand side of that chart. Having a view that everyone's Tahir, and Atla Sana'i having a view that everyone except for the obstinate are. Do you know what drove that difference, and also how common those positions are versus the position of Ayatollah Sistani?
So mainstream is Ayatollah Sistani's view and Ayatollah Khui's view. That's the mainstream view amongst contemporary Shia jurists, usulis. Ayatollah Sani, I would assume it's based on the whole term of the kafir. The kafir being somebody who is obstinately against the truth. I would assume based on that he reaches that conclusion. Sayyid Fadlullah, on the other hand, his premise is based on, I think, a more ethical framework, where, of course, dictated by the Quran and Sunnah, where he reaches that conclusion that everyone is pure.
Now, just expanding on Mikdad's question. So if you look at it, even in the moon sighting, yeah. So when Ayatollah Mohsin Hakim came, he was the first one to change it. Like he said, everything from a certain longitude, east of that, anything which was west of that, we had to follow. And then Ayatollah Khui came and talked about sharing the night. But then So what we're saying is that the consensus may change, but then you have Ayatollah Sistani now. He has reverted back with a different viewpoint. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things would change in a certain way. It may go the other way as well. Yeah.
It can go other ways. Yeah. That's a possibility. Yeah. However, I wouldn't use the term consensus in this situation.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, it's the same thing with eating.
Maybe you could say mainstream view.
Yeah. So it's the same thing with eating. I mean, Sayyid Mohsin Hakim started it, and then, but then again, Ayatollah Khoi said, "Yeah, I agree, but."
Yeah. I mean, if there is a mujtahid who has a large following, and he has a certain framework that he works with, he would reach a conclusion different to what may have been popular prior to him. So yeah, I agree with you totally.
Any final question? Yeah, final question.
Just for your interest, Ali Reza, when after his ruling, Sayyid Mohsin Hakim came here for medical treatment. So we went to see him, and then we were joking with him. We were saying that, look, if you hadn't changed your ruling, you couldn't be treated here because you've been najis all the time. You have to be really careful. Yeah. He was laughing, but he said, well, that is what it is. But many people were unhappy with his ruling here. When he came, they went to visit him and they said, no, you are wrong. You can't consider these people as tahir.
Many scholars or many...
No, many lay people like us. Yeah.
And why do you think people would be unhappy with that?
Because they said we have been brought up learning this all the time from Atullah Barujardi and so on. And now you are coming and I don't know what you are doing.
So going against the norm, basically.
Yeah.
Final chance. Okay, I think we'll end there. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Just a couple of quick announcements. Next week we have Fatima Zahra Ibrahim, who's the co-executive director of Green New Deal, the climate activist and a social justice campaigner who will be talking about the Green New Deal. The week after we have Adam Ramadan, who will be speaking to us about when legal theory meets identity. And he's at Al-Mahdi Institute. And the week after we have Sheikh Nuru, who'll be speaking to us about analyzing the rights of children in Islam, and that will be the week after. You can find out more on the screen and on our website on sikkim.org.uk. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.